and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Senior Biden administration officials say the path to denuclearization of North Korea will include interim steps. The need for threat reduction is also mentioned. Today, we discuss whether this signals a shift in the Biden administration's North Korea policy.
We're ready and willing to engage in discussions with the DPRK about threat reduction, especially currently in light of the situation on the Korean Peninsula.
Denuclearization is not going to happen overnight. I think everybody knows this.
지, 해, 공, 사이버, 우주 자산 등을 활용한 다영역 작전과 북핵 위협 무력화 등에 중점을 두고 실전적으로 실시하며
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder is appointed as the new president of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Mr. Robert Peters, the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Peters served as the lead strategist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He was also the special advisor for countering weapons of mass destruction in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Peters, NSC Senior Director for Indo-Pacific, Mira Rapp-Hooper, said that the U.S. is going to consider interim steps towards the denuclearization of North Korea. Now, this was in response to the question whether the U.S. would draw North Korea into threat reduction and arms control negotiations. And the day after, senior official for DPRK, Dr. Chung Pak, said that there would be interim steps considered towards that denuclearization. Now, is this the manifestation of the long-held view by some Democrats to pursue nuclear freeze in exchange for sanctions relief?
So I think there are a lot of Democrats that would like to see the North Korean nuclear problem go away. There's a long history of trying to engage in arms control and threat reduction talks within the Democratic Party to achieve that. I will say that I am very skeptical of any kind of meaningful talks that get at denuclearization, understanding that interim steps are not full denuclearization, but it's a way to engage in threat reduction activities or transparency. But that said, I think that there's enough American officials who work these issues in both parties that have frankly been burned too many times by the North Koreans to believe that we're going to get anywhere meaningful. I think the general view within both parties is that you cannot trust the North Koreans. They break their agreements. And so I'm just very skeptical that there's any there when it comes to these statements.
Mr. Snyder, two senior officials day after day talked about interim steps with North Korea. Does this signal a shift in the policy?
Well, I do think there is a slight policy shift, but I don't think that it's really around the issue of interim measures. What Mira Rapp-Hooper said really focused on military deconfliction and de-escalation activities intended to avoid misperception and inadvertent escalation. And so I think that where she's going with this is the need for some kind of crisis communication channel with North Korea to deal with rising potential conventional tensions on the peninsula. I think that it's motivated both by the escalation in tensions on the peninsula that we've seen rhetorically between North and South Korea, and also by the fact that we are in election season here. The problem really is not necessarily the proposal, which is, in my view, going from denuclearization only to denuclearization plus, but rather the timing of the proposal and the strategic environment are adverse to the possibility that it's really going to yield benefits.
Mr. Peter, what do you make of the timing of these remarks?
I mean, I think the timing, there's elections coming up both in Korea in the next 6 weeks and, of course, the American elections within the next 7 months. And so I do have to wonder if this is an attempt by the Biden administration to get a win on the board when it comes to arms control issues, which are an important part for some members of the Democratic base.
Now, Mr. Peters, in fact, past nuclear negotiations with North Korea did include interim steps, and those negotiations all failed because North Korea reneged on its commitment. Now, to pursue phased approach again, some say that it is ignoring the past and it is only bound to fail. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And so if you look back for the past 30 years, with Jimmy Carter going to North Korea in the Clinton administration, to the six-party talks under President Bush, to the failed attempts between President Trump and Mr. Kim, I think what you see is time and time again, we have a bipartisan attempt to get at meaningful discussions with the North Koreans. And the North Koreans, from an American's perspective, they lie and cheat their way through until the Americans get fed up and walk away. And so do I think these are bound to fail? I would say yes.
And Mr. Snyder, it's widely known that North Korea has the second and the third covert nuclear facilities, and then what to do about the clandestine uranium enrichment activities there. Former nuclear negotiators said that it is not possible to catch North Korea doing clandestine uranium enrichment activities.
Well, the issue of uranium enrichment goes all the way back to the failure of the agreed framework in the late 1990s, and that was also related to covert sites. At that time, I think that the U.S. Was apprised and discovered that that activity was going on. It actually led to the breakdown of the agreed framework. So in my view, we're not going to be depending on North Korea to tell us what they have. We're always going to be depending on our own intelligence efforts as related to engagement with North Korea. But the core issue really in all of these, this cycle of negotiation and failure is that we have not seen evidence of North Korean reciprocity or willingness to accept verification. And those are the essential ingredients, I think, for a process of this sort to move forward. I don't want to prejudge what might happen in the future, but I would say if we see that we do not have those elements, then it's an indication that the timing is wrong for re-engaging with North Korea.
As a former government official who has expertise on WMD, how much intelligence does U.S. have on North Korea's secret facilities?
Well, look, I mean, it's just drawing upon what's in the open source. It's really difficult for any intelligence agency to understand what's going on inside of North Korea unless they have exquisite human access. And I think the history there is that Western intelligence agencies, by and large, don't have great insight into what's going on inside of North Korea because of the difficulty of finding people on the ground that's willing to share information. And I think part of the challenges that we had in the Trump administration for what was then called complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization was the ability to verify the North Korean declarations, which, as Mr. Snyder pointed out, that was going to be at the willingness of the North Koreans to take American inspectors to key locations that the North Koreans declared, then take the Americans there. But at no point, is my understanding, was that there's going to be an ability for Americans to go to suspected sites and say, we want to look over here, or we want to look over there. That was never in the cards during the Trump administration's talks with Mr. Kim. And so I think it's going to be very difficult for us ever to know if there are clandestine sites in North Korea in which there could be nuclear activities going on, and that ultimately is going to hamper any kind of meaningful denuclearization talks between the United States and North Korea.
And even if the United States has knowledge of those secret facilities, given the nature of the uranium enrichment, wouldn't it be impossible to know whether North Korea has run that centrifuge or not?
I wouldn't say impossible, but it's going to be pretty difficult to figure out how much they've stockpiled at what degree of enrichment. And so you can tell that if they're using centrifuges to enrich uranium, and you can even get small sample sizes to see to what degree that uranium's been enriched, but it's really hard to identify how much they've enriched and then where that material may be that could be go into a nuclear warhead.
Mr. Peters, a senior official for DPRK, Jung Bak, said that there would have to be interim steps toward ultimate denuclearization. Now, that could be some kind of common sense, but why signal that before negotiations?
So my understanding of how North Korea understands denuclearization, it includes the Americans pulling back its extended nuclear deterrence commitments to South Korea. And so I think from a North Korean perspective is, we'll give up our nuclear weapons, but we have to see stepwise reciprocity on the part of the Americans in which you will pull back your extended nuclear umbrella over the South Koreans. And I'll say that I don't think there's any appetite within the American government to do that thing. And so if we're using the North Korean definition of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, I don't see that happening anytime in the foreseeable future.
Mr. Snyder, there was recent report citing sources that President Trump is considering nuclear freeze with North Korea and North Korea stop developing new weapons in exchange for sanctions relief. Now, there's a criticism that this would only acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear state. And President Trump's idea and what Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper laid out, aren't they essentially the same?
It's hard to evaluate that because
because they all involve interim steps and phased approach. And
I understand where you're trying to go with the question, but I think that the problem is that we have a poorly sourced report that President Trump subsequently denied. So let me just take what I think would be the major concern of the community, would be the possibility that based on what we saw in the first Trump administration, that President Trump might want to engage with North Korea and make some kind of deal in which he tries to manage the North Korea issue, but he claims that he's solving the North Korea issue. In other words, possibly actually engaging in that kind of quid pro quo that would say, okay, well, North Korea is a nuclear state, so what? And we're going to make some concessions in return. I think that is different from what Mira Rapp-Hooper actually proposed because she's continuing to focus on denuclearization. Now, what President Trump might actually be thinking and what he might actually do, I don't think that the Politico report really gives us very much insight into what that would actually look like.
I raised this up because there was a lot of criticism on the idea that was presented in that report.
In terms of the Politico report. Well, yeah, I think there was a response, and I think that a lot of that response was really driven by the anxiety or the concern that somehow a renewed Trump interaction with Kim Jong-un would involve selling out U.S. interests by actually recognizing North Korea and accepting it as a nuclear state.
Mr. Peters, you were in the government during the Trump administration. Now, you were not directly involved in those negotiations, but you were still part of that community who looked at CVID process. And do you think there is a chance that if there is a second Trump administration, that it may consider phased approach and not the big deal, one-step approach initially during the first Trump administration?
I'm pretty hesitant to believe that even if President Trump wins a second term, that there will be a meaningful effort to get at even a phased stepwise approach to denuclearization with North Korea. I think there's too many people who are in government, who are still in government, just as bureaucrats, who feel burned by the experience of the talks with North Korea the last time. I think there was an effort to see if it was actually possible to pull it off, and I think that there's a belief in many Americans' minds who work these issues that there was never a real attempt on the part of the North Koreans in 2018 to get to some kind of meaningful deal. And in some ways, this is kind of like Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football, with the American cartoon in which Charlie Brown continuously tries to kick the football, and at the last minute, Lucy pulls it away. And so I think there's a feeling in many's minds that we don't want to do this again.
You're very negative about any negotiation with North Korea, then what to do? Just deterrence?
I think it's possible to establish potentially a hotline for communication. I'm very reticent to believe that we're going to have any kind of meaningful transparency or data exchanges between the United States and North Korea. So I think ultimately it comes down to deterrence, yes. And I think that we have to take the steps that we need to ensure that we deter any kind of North Korean nuclear employments, either against the United States or against South Korea or Japan. When do I think denuclearization will happen is after the Kim regime falls. I think that's the only way you get there.
Mr. Snyder, U.S. officials stress the ultimate goal is denuclearization, but some in Washington go a step further and endorse peaceful coexistence with nuclear North Korea, including a leading Democratic congressman. Now, is this a realistic alternative, or is this just falling for North Korea's game plans?
I think that the idea of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state and making peace with North Korea is a bad idea, and it's based on a wrong assumption that the U.S. is the hostile party. And I think that the other problem with that idea at this moment is that it hasn't aged well at all, because now we're at a point where North Korea is claiming that South Korea is the main enemy. It's operationalizing tactical nuclear weapons potentially to use against South Korea. And, a proposal that says, well, the U.S. is going to ignore all that and normalize relations with North Korea and make peace with North Korea, well, it runs in direct opposition to the spirit and the letter of the alliance commitment that the U.S. has to the defense of South Korea.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, there is growing concerns in South Korea among the political circle, among the general public, that the United States may recognize North Korea as a nuclear state. And they say, therefore, let's go hurry up, make a nuclear weapon. Now, are we nearing criticality that U.S. may no longer be able to suppress South Korea's nuclear drive?
Well, I'm not sure nearing criticality is exactly the right phrase that I would use at this moment in that particular discussion. I think that the U.S. approach really is about upholding the NPT. And therefore, if the U.S. decides to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state, we're abandoning the NPT as a mechanism by which to restrain global nonproliferation. And so I really don't think that the U.S. is going to be able to divorce itself from that position. But I also think that as I look at South Korea's situation, I don't think that South Korea should try to add stress to an NPT system that is already under stress. And instead, I think that what South Korea should be doing is watching carefully. And if the NPT actually collapses, it's a new world. It's a more dangerous world. And it's a world actually in which South Korea would be able to proceed unrestrained in its pursuit of its own autonomous defense. But I don't think that South Korea has an interest in being the straw that breaks the NPT camel's back.
Now, there's already concerns in South Korea that the talk of interim steps may actually lead to arms control discussions between Washington and Pyongyang. South Korea's unification minister today said that South Korea cannot accept arms control talks that recognize North Korea's nuclear status.
And I don't think that's what the U.S. has in mind or what any of the U.S. officials have said. But this is obviously an issue that requires very close coordination between the U.S. and South Korea. It has been a top priority in the relationship for a long time. And I would be very surprised if whatever new wording is being used to describe the U.S. government's approach hadn't already been very actively discussed between the Biden and Yoon administrations.
And Mr. Snyder, the Freedom Shield exercises did not include the scenario where North Korea uses nuclear weapons. This will be exercised during the summer. There are summer exercises. And under the Nuclear Consultative Group, the idea of nuclear drill is still ambiguous. Are we, the U.S. and South Korea, closer to the nuclear sharing that South Korea wants, or is South Korea's role strictly supporting with conventional weapons, as the United States has clarified many times?
Well, I think there are actually two parts to that particular question. One is, what is Freedom Shield doing as related to preparing for the possibility of nuclear use on the peninsula? And my understanding is that that is a component of the exercise. But then there's also the issue of the Nuclear Consultative Group and the discussions about nuclear sharing that are ongoing and that are likely to reach some kind of decision point later this year. And there, what I would note is that at the time of the establishment of the Nuclear Consultative Group, South Korean officials talked about nuclear sharing. At the latest meeting in December, they talked about a unitary approach. And so I think that does represent a rhetorical shift that possibly also may show that some kind of progress has been made. I don't think that we're going to know precisely what the outcome of that is until we get to the spring and summer, but I think that it's very clear that through that channel there is the opportunity for both sides to hear each other's concerns and try to work out a common approach as related to the nuclear dimension of the challenge.
Mr. Peters, United States continued to reaffirm its security commitment to South Korea, but there are some in Washington who say such commitment is no longer feasible under circumstances where U.S. confronts with China or if North Korea acquires ICBM that can attack U.S. mainland. Now, do you agree that there is a fundamental daylight between United States and South Korea? Should this be a wake-up call for the South Koreans?
There's always some daylight between allies. I mean, I'm hard-pressed to think of a single instance in which two allies there is no daylight between their interests. What I would say is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the interests of the United States and South Korea. As to the question is I think you may be asking, is the American deterrence guarantee to South Korea still credible? To that point, I would say absolutely. The United States faced off against a Soviet Union that had 30,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War and said explicitly, we are willing to hold Chicago, New York, Washington at risk in order to protect and defend Paris and Bonn and then later on Warsaw and so forth. And Korea has the exact same security guarantee that we extend to our European allies. And so I don't see the much, much, much smaller North Korean nuclear threat that does have the ability with the Hwasong-18 to reach out and touch North America as being somehow greater than the Soviet threat that we faced during the Cold War. Now that said, that's not to say we should be dismissive of the North Korean nuclear threat. We absolutely should take it seriously, and I think what you see in Washington is that we do take it seriously. But that said, I think we need to ensure that we maintain a credible deterrent to include potentially stationing nuclear munitions in South Korea. I'm supportive of that idea, as well as shoring up our entire theater nuclear capabilities across the Western Pacific. And this is why you see in Congress today support for SLICM-N, the Sea-Launched Nuclear Cruise Missile. And that's a weapon system that can hold at-risk targets in China, to be sure, but also North Korea. In many ways, it's ideally developed to support holding at-risk targets in North Korea.
North Korea does have a smaller nuclear arsenal than USSR, as you say, but the idea comes because the United States has to focus on China mainland and cannot really protect South Korea.
I wouldn't say that's the case at all. And moreover, when I think about the North Korean military threat to South Korea, I look at the South Korean army and I think it can more than readily handle the North Korean army. And so the American forces that are there today primarily consist of American Air Wings, 5th generation fighters, and some 4th generation fighters to provide air support, as well as high-end digital ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the nuclear umbrella. If there's a fight between North Korea and South Korea, a lot of those capabilities would be in support of South Korea. I think the only thing that we may want to consider withholding would be long-range precision fires, such as cruise missiles. But that said, South Korea has a very robust, independent cruise missile arsenal of its own, which can service those same targets. And so, I think we'll be looking at in the coming years increasing American force presence in the Western Pacific, and a lot of that force presence can deter and, if necessary, defeat both North Korea but also China. And so I know there's some concern in South Korea about the Americans throttling back on its support to South Korea so that it can deter China. I think once you actually unpack what those actual munitions are and what our force posture is, there's a lot less worry to be concerned there.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Peters, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.